Hey guys, welcome back. So tonight we're going to see if we can finish up this Radio Shack Porsche. All the electronics have arrived, so we'll see if we can get it, get everything installed tonight and test it out on the bench. It's windy and rainy tonight, so I don't think we're going to get a test run on the road, but we'll see if we can maybe do something in the house. All right, so stay tuned. Let's see if we can get this thing going. All right, so I figured the first thing we'd try would be the servo, and turns out it's going to be remarkably easy. So these ears, mounting ears on this servo, happen to fit right in these two little notches here in front of this antenna post or this LED post. And this little guy just almost like it was made for it. Just drops right in. Watch this. Boom. And I put the steering linkage back on. It'll attach to a servo horn on that output shaft there. And that's going to line up just about perfectly. It's I could not have asked for that to be more perfect. So what we're going to do for that, I'm going to build up these cavities here with some double-sided tape and run a single strip across. Maybe two, just to lift the servo up off the bottom of the chassis a little bit. Mount the servo in there and then replace the strap maybe with another piece of tape across the top, and that'll make sure the servo doesn't wiggle around and mess with the steering. Alright, so I ended up needing to stack 3 pieces of double-sided tape in each one of these little channels, and then I ran one final one across the top. And then we're going to wiggle this servo into there and stick it to the tape. There we go. Just like that. Give it a good squeeze. That adhesive's pressure sensitive, so the harder you squeeze it, the stronger it sticks. Alright, so that's in there. That is definitely not going to move. And to make sure of that, you'll remember this little piece here that goes across the top. I'm going to run maybe 1 or 2 more pieces of tape here, and then strap this sucker down on top, and that's going to keep that servo in there. Alright, put the tape in place there. This thing has got a little bow to it, probably because of the way it was originally installed. So I'm going to make sure I install it so that bow puts tension on the tape. It's just one little extra thing that'll keep that servo in place. Because if we hit anything while we're driving with the front tires, that impact is going to be transmitted through this little steering linkage right to the servo. And if the servo's loose, worst case it bounces out, but you know, even if it doesn't completely come out, if it shifts around, it's going to impact, it's going to have an effect on the steering trim. You know, so if this servo moves a millimeter this way, the wheels are going to move a millimeter that way, and the car's not going to drive straight. Alright, that is in there. That is not coming out unless you want it to. Alright, next let's see if we can get this speed controller back here. Okay, I really like this spot here for the speed controller. It looks like it'll fit right in there very nicely. I won't have to add any extensions to these motor wires. They'll reach the motor with no problem. And I can probably, maybe not, I was hoping I can get the battery plug outside into this radio box, into the battery box without extending the wire or cutting a hole. So we're going to have to extend the wire here a little bit, because the best way I can see to go in there is going to be around the side, and it's just not going to be a long enough wire to make that run. No big deal. Alright, let's start some cutting and some soldering. Alright, so the first thing I did, I cut the connectors off of the motor wires here. They were little bullet connectors, snipped them off and stripped some wire. And then I applied some soldering flux to the wire. Helps the solder flow and get a better connection. So what I'm going to do first is tin those connections. That's just putting some solder on the wires. It helps, makes things a lot quicker. So I'm going to put this here. Hopefully you can see a little better. Alright, so you want to use a nice clean hot soldering iron. Alright, so nice and clean. Use a damp rag if you got to wipe the tip off. Sometimes it gets a little nasty while you're using it. And then you want the thing to be hot enough that the solder immediately melts. Right, so see that? Just as soon as you touch it, it's liquid. And then all I'm going to do is get some on here, on the soldering iron, and just touch the solder to the end of this wire. I'm not sure if you'll see that, but the solder is going to flow right down the strands of the wire. And this all just wipes off. So now those wires are not only coated on the outside, but the solder has flowed down in between every strand of copper there. So the whole tip of that wire is coated in solder. All right, then the next thing we'll do is attach it to the car. All right, so the polarity on this motor it's not labeled anywhere. I don't see a plus or a minus mark, or sometimes you get a little red paint dot on there to indicate what's positive and what's negative. So we're gonna guess. You know, it doesn't really matter on a motor this small. On motors, higher performance motors, they do run in a certain direction due to the timing of the armature. But even if this one did, it's not going to impact anything. One thing I do want to make sure, I want to hold the speed control over here, or place it over here, is what I'm going to actually stick it down with tape, so that the wires get soldered to the motor pointing the direction they'll be pointing. That way, you know, you're not, if I solder it this way, then the wire's got to turn over here. That's going to put fatigue on that joint. It's going to eventually come apart. So I'm going to tape this down into where it's going to live, and then we'll get those wires attached. All right, so just got some double-sided tape on there. I'm going to run the motor wires on this side because that's closer to the motor. This is the battery connector. And just stick that sucker right down in there. Very nice. Good. Good, good, good. All right, so I'm going to stick this negative wire on this back terminal. I'm going to just add a tiny bit of solder. I'm going to first get this out of the way so we don't burn it. I'm going to add a little bit of solder to that terminal just so it has more to grab onto. There we go. And then I'm going to make a nice easy bend in this wire. I don't want to put any crazy bends or stress on it. And I'm going to heat the wire with the soldering iron until the solder melts on the wire, and then that melts the solder on the motor. And we're good. All right, that'll stay on there until the cows come home. Don't know what time that is. All right, same thing over here. Add a little bit of solder, make my life easier. I'm gonna see how that got nasty already. We're just gonna take it real quick, and good as new. All right. Same thing with this one. We're gonna make a nice easy bend over here. Heat up the wire, which will melt the solder on the wire and then the motor, and that's attached. Just got to hold it in place until it dries. That's important. If it gets wiggled while it's drying, it's going to be real weak. It's called a cold solder joint, and they easily break apart. But these, you could probably hang the car from the wall from them. That's going to hold up nice. All right, so I've got the little XT30 connector there. I think I called it an EC30 before, but they're XT30s. They're very small. They're about 8 millimeters across. I like using them. They're good for little projects like this. So I'm just going to tin up this connector here. I've already tinned the battery wire. So that's all that takes. Just barely touch it. Now I'm going to attach this wire to that terminal. So you heat up the solder, and then once it makes connection, you just hold it still until it dries. And then last but not least, put the shrink wrap on. That has to go on the wire beforehand. You just slide that up over the connections. Make sure you never short out those terminals, and that's that. So we'll do the same thing for the other wire. And then another tip, you'll see I've got both sides of this connector here. A lot of times when you heat these things up, they'll warp. So if you have the connector connected together, it'll draw some of the heat away into this connector, which helps. And then even if it does get too hot, being plugged in would keep it lined up. So that's a good trick. Put some heat on the shrink wrap. That'll shrink it down. Really form fits the connection so they won't slide off. Alright, I got this little scrap piece of red and black wire. I'm going to use that to extend this wire so it can make its way into the battery box. So same thing, we tinned up these connectors, and we'll attach it to that connector there. Alright, you just slide them up into place. Make sure they're up against the connector. Heat them up. That'll shrink right down around the wire. And keep you from shorting out, and also makes it look a lot better. Alright, and finally for the speed controller, we're going to knock this old connector off it. I say old, it's an old style connector. The cars in the 80s used to use these. They're called, well, I call them Tamiya connectors. I don't know the actual name for the connector. It's common, inexpensive terminal. Works. And just show you here, we'll just strip a little more of the wire off this time, because we're going to connect two wires together. So here we want to guess about how much wire we're going to need to go into the car. We can assume that these will just end right at the battery box there. So I'm probably going to give it maybe like 4 or 5 inches of wire to mess around in there in case you have to connect the battery. So we're going to cut these right about here. And strip about the same amount of wire on this one as we did here. So again, just come around here. I have wire strippers somewhere, but this is faster for right now. Alright, so those are exposed. We're going to expose both of these. There we go. Now we're going to use this little guy to push this wire into that one, like this, and hold it in place while we solder it together. Alright, so right now I just have the two wires pushed together. If I almost touch it at all, they'll fall apart. But we like to make sure, or I like to make sure that it's pretty flat here. You don't want any wires sticking out the side. And then once you're sure it's in a good spot, just use the other clamps. That'll hold that there and it will not move. Then we're going to take a little flux over here. And we're just going to flow the solder into that joint. And it's going to physically connect two wires together and also make electrical contact. You see that? Alright, so let that cool down and dry. Just takes a second. The wet rag helps. Then, to finish it up, same deal. Take your shrink wrap, slide it right over so the connection is centered. And we're going to heat that up. There we go. So you can see that's a really nice connection. It will never come apart and it will never short out. Just like wire insulation here. I'll do the same thing to the other one. Alright, hit this guy here. So the speed controller is installed. I'll mount this switch with some tape. I'll run this wire in through the battery box, but that component is now done. Alright, so next up we'll just mount the receiver in here. I'm thinking of mounting it right about here in the middle of the car. I'm going to check. Yeah, we got plenty of clearance. There's nothing in the body that's going to interfere there. We're going to keep this guy a little high up in the car right there. Got a little tape on there. Mount it so the words face forward just for aesthetics. Just stick it right in there in the middle. And again, it's pressure sensitive, so a little squeeze. That's there. Now we're going to temporarily, we'll tie this wire up later, but we'll hook the speed controller wire, which is channel 2, plug that into the receiver here, and then the steering, which is channel 1. That goes here. So just for giggles right now, what we'll do is plug in a battery and see if we get some motor running action. So here's our little 2-cell battery. I'm going to make sure this switch is off so we don't get any surprises. Oh, it's not marked. Okay. Well, we're going to guess. There we go. And this guy here, get the Here you can see where I got the wire coming through to the battery box. Plug her in. Alright, that's on. So I'm going to leave this in here for later. No reason to take it out right now, so I'll get this closed back up. Try. Something's hanging me up here. I don't know what it is. There it goes. That was an ordeal. Alright. So this is blinking. I don't know what that means. But it looks like we're good. So I'm going to give the radio some throttle. Alright. So we've got forward wheel motion when I pull the trigger forward. So these wires are correct. We guessed it correctly. And that seems pretty powerful, so I'm interested to see how that's going to run. That's a 2-cell battery. It'll be quicker with the 3-cell, but so that's good. We've got the back half of the car pretty much done. So one more thing I almost forgot. I'm not going to mount this switch. This is going to be real easy to just cut these wires and use this switch, which is integrated in the car already, instead of this one. So let's do that now. So real quick, the way these switches work, I hope you can see that. There's 6 terminals on this one, so this one's a dual throw switch. What that means is these 2 poles in the middle are where the power comes in. If the switch is flipped that way, it'll route the power through this side, and if it's that way, it'll route the power through this side. So we want the power to route through the switch when it's in the on marked position, obviously, which is this side. It's the left side of the car if you were inside it driving. Alright, so I snipped off the factory switch on the speed controller. I left a little pigtail here because this is a neat switch. I'll see if the guy wants it. If not, I'll throw it in my parts box. That's a nice little small switch. You never know when you're going to need something like that. So if you have something like this you're cutting off, I always try to keep an inch or 2 of wire on it just to make it easier to reuse. Alright, the polarity, or in other words, where these wires go on this switch, doesn't matter as long as one's on the middle and one's on the end, and they're both on the same pole. It's just routing power through the switch. It's not any kind of circuit that needs a positive and a negative on a certain side. So again, just hit that with some solder. Hit this with some solder. Whoa, alright, so that's on. Forgot about that. That's good. When I touched the wire, the car turned on. Alright, so that's done. Now just to double check, when I flip this switch on the bottom, the car should turn on. Yep. Good to go. So we're going to look at the front of the car again now. I'm going to use this round servo horn. It's a very generic servo horn. Easy to use, lots of holes in it for different mounting options. We're going to make sure the servo is centered. So basically we're going to take the radio, we're going to look at the steering trim, make sure it's in the center, which it is. Whoops. Try not to drive the car off the table. And then what I'm going to do is work this Z-bend here. The way this is set up, it's going to have to go behind the servo wheel, so we're going to make sure everything clears. Now that's stuck down there. So I'm going to put this guy through the back hole, the back of one of these servo horn holes. So it's like that. And then with the wheels centered and with the servo centered via the radio, I'm going to try to pop this sucker on here in such a way that the wheels are as straight or as close to straight ahead as possible. That's not bad. Whoops, sorry about the camera. My big head. So that's good. That's that. So I'm going to run a screw up through here to keep that servo horn on the servo. And if the car does drift to the one side or the other, because I can see right now these aren't perfectly straight ahead, they're turned a little bit to the left, we can use the steering trim on the radio to make some minor adjustments to where the center of the wheels are. And let's see, one last thing. If I turn this wheel to the right, the car turns to the left, right? So that would be difficult to drive. Luckily our radio supports servo reversing, so we'll do the steering. Whoops, sorry, out of the picture there. Steering reverse right there, just flip that switch. Retrim the wheels. That's pretty good. And now turning the steering wheel right turns the car right. That's good to go. Alright, so I got that screw in there to hold the servo horn on. That was difficult. The steering setup here and the rest of the car kind of blocks where the screwdriver had to go, so that was a exercise in patience, but it went in. Alright, did a little housekeeping. Zip tied the slack up in these wires just so they don't bounce around. I like doing that. This guy will be in the battery box, so we don't have to worry about him. I might tie these two together. Actually, I'm going to do that right now. The reason being, I don't want this wire rubbing on this metal plate. That'll eventually cut through the insulation and we'll have a short. So I'm not going to make this real tight, just enough to keep the two wires together. Zip ties are cheap, and when cars and parts aren't, so I like to protect the wires. And then finally the antenna. If this was a typical car that you drive, you know, far or race or something like that, you want to have the antenna up as high as possible. That's what this tube here is for. The antenna would go in it and then it would mount somewhere in the car. This thing, we're going to see how it runs with the antenna. I'm just going to tape it down in place here. I think it'll be fine. I've done that with other Tyco and Radio Shack cars, and I think the distance will be just fine, but we'll definitely test it out. And if we need to, it would be a shame, but you know, we could maybe drill a hole in the body somewhere. I'd hate to do that. Or maybe even, I don't know, move the receiver somewhere in the back so we can use this factory antenna hole. But I don't think it'll be a problem. I think it'll be fine the way it is here. Alright, so for tying the antenna down and other things that are permanent, or semi-permanent, I picked up this roll of 3M electrical tape quite some time ago. It was actually, I was using it to tape up hatches on an RC boat. Somebody had recommended it, but I use it for lots and lots of stuff. It's super, super thin. It's like razor thin. It reminds me of Kapton tape. I don't know if it's the same stuff or just the 3M version of the Kapton tape. But it's like, it's as thin as cellophane. And the adhesive on it is very, very strong. Like I said, it's even waterproof. I used to use it on boats. So I'm just going to, you know, gently route this thing, maybe tie it down back here. And that antenna will just sit there. And we'll check the reception. Alright, let's get the body shell back on and maybe try to get a test drive in. Alright, body shell went on without much of an argument. Sometimes you mess up and something you installed in there will not let the body clear, but went back together no problem. These two screws in the back here will not tighten down. The owner did show me when we first looked at the car that this was loose. We thought maybe the screws just backed out. The posts don't look cracked, but I'm guessing they're stripped out, so I'm going to address those. I'm going to first try to use, it's a trick, put a little bit of tape on the screw threads and see if they grab. And if not, then I'll hit it with some CA, some crazy glue. Let that dry and then run the screw into it and that'll hold it. Same thing up here. This one in the front. This one was good. This one was loose. But that's it. She's back together. Nice and tight. No rattles. Let's make sure it all still works. So we'll turn the radio on first. It's a good rule of thumb. You want to have a signal to the car. The newer cars don't really care, but it's just an old habit. And let's flip the car on. Alright, that seems happy. Let's see, right turn, left turn, forward, back. Alright, burnout. Alright, so it looks pretty powerful. I can't wait to get this thing on the road. Let's go see what the weather's like. Alright, it is very nasty out. Cold, windy, but it stopped raining. So I'm going to do a quick run here. The road's very bouncy. Alright. That's good. Runs good. Alright, so just a couple final things here. I took these battery terminals out. It was just a matter of bending these tabs back and they popped right out, so they're still totally usable. So we'll stick them in a bag with some of the other original parts so we can hold on to those. So with those removed, this is the 3-cell battery that we were thinking about using. It fits in there perfectly, like it was made for it. So that's really nice, right? And let's take a look at these body posts. Yeah, so it's weird. There's no cracking. Usually they'll split up the side and then they won't hold screws anymore, but these aren't split. So what I'll do, I'm just gonna run some crazy glue into those holes and let it dry, and then when you put the screw back in, it bites into the glue and it'll hold it. Same thing for the front one up here. So that's it. Okay, so that's it for today. Thanks for checking it out. Pete, I hope you like it. Hope sooner or later we'll get to see each other and you could drive it, you know, but we're all locked down right now. So yeah, it was an easy one. Wasn't too bad. Any questions? Either comment on the video or comment through my website. And thanks for watching.